Dearest listeners, there exists in the annals of proper society no creature more terrifying to ambitious mamas than the confirmed spinster. That rare lady who, having reached the perilous age of 27, declares herself perfectly content without matrimonial shackles. Yet even more alarming is the spinster who proclaims her independence with the fierce pride of Highland clans, her refusal echoing through drawing rooms like a battle cry. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most tempestuous tale of vows broken and hearts conquered, wherein a Scottish rose with thorns as sharp as thistles met an English gentleman who dared to brave her defenses. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the finest Madeira, must be savored properly. Miss Fiona McAllister arrived at Thornfield Manor in Derbyshire on a grey April afternoon in 1815. Her presence announced by the rather undignified commotion of her refusing to wait for the footman's assistance in descending from the carriage. Lady Margaret Sutherland, her English cousin and unfortunate hostess, watched from the drawing-room window as Fiona leapt down with a flash of petticoats that would have sent any proper London miss into vapours. The Scottish girl, though at 27 one could scarcely call her a girl, stood in the drive with the posture of a Highland queen surveying conquered territory. Most striking was the cascade of copper hair already escaping its pins, curls the color of sunset fire dancing about a face liberally scattered with freckles that spoke of days spent under open skies rather than sheltered beneath parasols. Fiona had not arrived in England by choice. Her father, Laird Duncan McAllister of Glencarrick, had sent her south in a final desperate attempt to save his daughter from the fate she had so vehemently embraced: confirmed spinsterhood. The circumstances of her exile were the culmination of 5 years of rejected suitors, each refusal more scandalous than the last. The trouble had begun when Fiona turned 22. She had read Mary Wollstonecraft, scandalous enough, but worse, she had believed the revolutionary notions contained therein. Marriage, she declared to her horrified father, was nothing more than legal bondage, and she would sooner take the veil than submit to any man's authority. Her first rejected suitor had been Colin MacLeod, heir to substantial lands. The union would have united 2 powerful clans. She refused him after one conversation, declaring him a bore. The second suitor, young Angus Fraser, had fared worse. Fiona caught him attempting to dictate which books she might read after marriage and sent him packing with words so sharp his ears likely still burned. By her 5th rejection, the McAllister name had become synonymous throughout the Highlands with stubborn pride. Laird Duncan, watching his only child transform into what society termed an eccentric, had felt his options narrowing. The solution presented itself in Lady Margaret's letter offering to host Fiona for the summer season. Perhaps English propriety might soften the girl's sharp edges. Fiona had fought the arrangement with characteristic ferocity. England represented everything she despised: rigid hierarchies, suffocating conventions, false gentility. Her father played his final card. If she did not at least attempt to comport herself appropriately, he would accept old Malcolm Grant's offer for her hand, a widower of 60 seeking a young wife to manage his household. Faced with such a prospect, Fiona capitulated. She would go to England, observe their ridiculous customs, attend their tedious functions, but she would never, under any circumstances, accept a marriage proposal from an Englishman. This vow she swore upon her mother's memory. It was a cruel tactic, born not of malice, but of the panic of a father who saw loneliness closing around his only child like Highland mist, and who would use any weapon, however coarse, to drive it away. Lady Margaret descended to greet her cousin with affection, tempered by trepidation. Transforming this wild Highland girl into something approaching acceptability would require divine intervention. The following days proved Margaret's fears justified. There were endless lessons in proper English manners: how to make polite conversation about nothing, how to never venture out without a chaperone, how to master saying nothing while appearing to say everything. The matter of Fiona's appearance proved particularly vexing. Her freckles were considered a dreadful flaw by English standards. Fiona refused all preparations designed to bleach away the evidence of her outdoor life. If English society could not accept her as nature had made her, then English society could go hang. Her hair presented an even greater challenge. Fashion called for sleek, disciplined arrangements. Fiona's copper curls had apparently never heard of discipline and escaped every attempt at constraint within minutes. Yet, despite these frustrations, there remained something undeniably striking about her. Intelligence and directness rarely seen in drawing room misses. It was whispered throughout Derbyshire that Edmund Ashford, Viscount Weatherby, was in the market for a wife. This intelligence sent ambitious mamas into paroxysms of strategic planning. At 31, Lord Weatherby had reached that dangerous age where bachelorhood might become permanent. The whispers came not from Edmund himself, but from his mother, the Dowager Viscountess, whose determination to see her only surviving son married had reached obsessive proportions. She had buried 3 children, 2 sons to scarlet fever, a daughter who survived only days past birth. Edmund, the eldest, had become the sole repository of her hopes for continuing the Ashford line. Before taking up her pen to review the list of candidates, her gaze fell upon a delicate ivory miniature on her writing desk. The portrait of her second son, lost to fever years before. For an instant, the iron mask of the aristocrat cracked, revealing not merely ambition, but the terror of a mother who saw in Edmund the last bulwark against the oblivion of her lineage. She touched the miniature with trembling fingers, then straightened her spine and returned to her task with renewed determination. She had compiled a list of suitable candidates with military thoroughness. Miss Felicity Worthington, bland but heir to £10,000. Miss Arabella Sterling, blonde and vapid but connected to half the peerage. Miss Caroline Hartford, who had never expressed an original thought. The Dowager demanded impeccable lineage, substantial dowry, and above all, proper temperament, submissive, malleable, entirely lacking in opinions. Lord Edmund had proven remarkably resistant to these efforts. He was courteous to the young ladies paraded before him, but showed no particular favor to any. The truth was that Edmund found the entire marriage market profoundly depressing. He had watched friends marry for convenience and settle into patterns of polite indifference at best, active misery at worst. Edmund was not a romantic fool. He understood his responsibilities and the necessities of his position. Yet some stubborn part of him refused to abandon the notion that marriage might offer something beyond dynastic convenience. His lands were extensive, his fortune secure, his reputation untarnished. Yet, at every ball, every dinner party, he found himself conducting the same shallow conversations and feeling the same gnawing emptiness. Lady Margaret, learning that the Dowager would attend the Worthington Ball in 3 weeks' time, decided with romantic determination that this would be the perfect occasion to introduce her Highland cousin to Derbyshire society. That this plan filled Fiona with dread and Edmund with resignation merely demonstrated how little either understood about the caprices of fate. The Worthington Ball took place on a May evening, when spring had finally triumphed over winter. Fiona had been prepared for the ordeal with grim determination. Her gown, ivory silk commissioned from a London modiste, was elegant confection that would have graced any Mayfair ballroom. Upon Fiona's frame, however, it somehow looked less like a demure English miss and more like a Celtic warrior queen, grudgingly donning diplomatic robes. The freckles, naturally, remained undiminished. Fiona had refused all attempts to conceal what she considered honest evidence of her outdoor life. If the English found her sun-marked skin offensive, they were welcome to avert their delicate sensibilities. Worthington Hall blazed with candlelight, hundreds of beeswax tapers illuminating the magnificent ballroom. Fiona's entrance into the assembly caused a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like a sudden breeze on a stifling day. Fans that had been moving in languid rhythms halted mid-flutter. Heads inclined toward one another, and the hum of conversation changed pitch, punctuated by glances cast over shoulders and through quizzing glasses. Lady Haversham, raising her lorgnon, murmured to her neighbor a single audible word, extraordinary, imbuing it with the weight of condemnation. Fiona stood beside Margaret as introductions were performed, feeling the weight of assessing gazes. She had expected disapproval, but experiencing the reality of being examined like a curiosity proved more difficult than anticipated. Only Highland pride kept her spine straight and chin high. It was in this moment that Lord Edmund Ashford noticed her across the ballroom. He had been enduring yet another conversation with Miss Felicity Worthington, who detailed with numbing thoroughness improvements to the Worthington Gardens. Edmund had perfected his expression of polite interest whilst his thoughts wandered. He was calculating whether he could escape to the card room when something drew his attention across the crowded floor. She stood out like a flame among embers, this tall woman with hair the color of burnished copper and bearing that suggested she would rather be anywhere else. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense. Her features were too strong, her coloring too vivid, but she was arresting in a way that made conventional beauty seem rather dull. He found himself studying her with inappropriate attention. There was intelligence in the way she surveyed the room, a quality few ladies bothered to display in public. She did not simper or flutter her fan. Instead, she looked rather like a general assessing hostile territory. The introductions, when they occurred, were managed by Lady Margaret with diplomatic skill. She had observed Edmund's interest and immediately began steering Fiona toward that sector with determination that would have impressed military strategists. Lord Wetherby bowed over Fiona's hand with impeccable courtesy. Miss McAllister executed a curtsy that was technically correct, but somehow managed to convey the impression she was doing so under protest. Their first exchange revealed the chasm between them. Edmund, employing pleasant small talk, inquired whether Miss McAllister was enjoying her first English ball. Fiona, interpreting this as condescension, replied with directness that made Margaret wince that she had attended assemblies in Edinburgh that would put present company to shame. Edmund, startled by this forthright response, found himself actually paying attention. He observed that Edinburgh was renowned for its cultural sophistication, though he had heard Highland reels were rather vigorous for English sensibilities. Fiona's eyes shifted from moss green toward gold, a warning sign Margaret had learned to recognize. The Scottish girl informed Lord Edmund that Highland reels required actual skill and stamina, unlike the insipid country dances fashionable in London, where one merely walked through patterns while making polite conversation. This rejoinder, delivered in a voice that carried rather further than Margaret preferred, created a circle of silence. Several nearby matrons gasped. Miss Arabella Sterling actually giggled at the shocking directness. Edmund, however, felt something unexpected stir, something that might have been amusement or interest or relief at encountering genuine emotion after years of careful artifice. He found himself smiling, a real smile, rather than his polite version. He suggested that perhaps Miss McAllister might consent to prove her assertion by standing up with him for the next dance, if she could tolerate insipid English country dances for the duration of the set. Fiona, caught between her vow to avoid English entanglements and her competitive Highland pride, found herself accepting. After all, refusing would suggest she could not support her own arguments, and a McAllister never retreated from a challenge. The set that followed became local legend. Edmund found himself partnered with a woman who approached the figures with the concentration of a soldier in battle. Fiona executed each movement with precision, her natural athleticism evident. Yet there was nothing affected in her performance. She danced as she apparently did everything, with complete commitment and absolute honesty. As the dance progressed, Edmund inquired about her impressions of Derbyshire. She replied with marginally less hostility that the countryside was pleasant enough, though disappointingly tame compared to Highland mountains. He asked whether she missed Scotland. She informed him with surprising intensity that she missed it with every breath, that England felt like a cage constructed of politeness and pretense. This remarkable candor compelled Edmund to abandon his own social mask. He confessed that he sometimes felt equally trapped by expectations rather than geography, and that he occasionally envied those free to live according to their own desires. Fiona looked at him properly then and saw something unexpected in an English nobleman, a genuine person beneath the layers of privilege. It was disconcerting, threatening the neat categories into which she had organized the world. The dance concluded, and Edmund escorted Fiona back to Margaret. But as he bowed over her hand, he did something that surprised them both. He asked whether Miss McAllister rode, and if so, whether she might enjoy a morning excursion to survey the countryside, properly chaperoned. Fiona, her defenses temporarily lowered by unexpected connection, found herself agreeing before prudence could intervene. Margaret immediately offered her services as chaperone. Across the ballroom, the Dowager Viscountess observed this development with cold clarity. She had seen the way her son's attention focused, the manner in which his habitual mask had slipped. In 5 years of orchestrating his marital prospects, she had never witnessed him display such animation with any suitable young lady. The Scottish girl represented everything the Dowager had sought to protect against. She was unsuitable in bloodline, unsuitable in temperament, and most damning, she might actually engage Edmund's interest. Interested men made foolish decisions regarding marriage. The Dowager began her countermeasures that very evening, dropping careful words into receptive ears. The Scottish girl's freckles were mentioned, her height observed, her directness deplored. Questions were raised about her dowry and connections. The campaign was subtle but devastating. Designed to create social atmosphere so hostile, the girl would flee back to Scotland before causing further disruption. As the evening concluded, Fiona found herself experiencing emotions she had not anticipated. She had expected boredom at best, active hostility at worst. What she had not expected was to meet an Englishman capable of genuine conversation, who looked at her as though she were a person rather than a problem. "This was dangerous," a voice whispered. This was precisely the complication she had sworn to avoid. Yet as her carriage rolled through the Derbyshire night, she found herself remembering the way Edmund's eyes had shifted from polite interest to genuine engagement. She had made a vow upon her mother's memory. That vow remained sacred, unbreakable. Whatever momentary connection she had felt was merely the product of being far from home and lonely, nothing more. She told herself this repeatedly during the sleepless night that followed. By morning, she almost believed it. The morning excursion took place 3 days later. Fiona had spent those intervening days attempting to convince herself that her anticipation was merely craving outdoor exercise. That she had tried on 3 different riding habits before settling on dark green wool was purely practical. That she had permitted Bridget extra time arranging her hair was simple courtesy. Lord Edmund arrived precisely at the appointed hour, mounted on a magnificent bay gelding. He was accompanied by his groom Simmons, who possessed the discretion expected of upper servants. Margaret rode between them on a gentle mare, fulfilling her role as chaperone. Fiona's mount was a spirited chestnut with enough fire to please her Highland sensibilities. She sat the horse with easy competence, her seat more functional than elegant by English standards, but undeniably effective. They departed Thornfield's grounds and ventured onto paths winding through Derbyshire countryside. It was one of those perfect May mornings when England almost justified its reputation for bucolic beauty. Hedgerows white with hawthorn, meadows brilliant with buttercups, sky a pure blue. The conversation began with safe topics, but gradually deepened. Edmund inquired about Fiona's education. She described her mother's governess, Miss Pemberton, who had possessed the revolutionary notion that girls' minds were as capable as boys. Edmund revealed his Cambridge years, studying classics and natural philosophy, before duty recalled him to manage estates. As the morning progressed, something shifted. The combative edge softened into genuine curiosity. Fiona described the wild beauty of Glen Carrick, granite peaks scraping clouds, lochs reflecting sky like mirrors, ancient stone circles. Edmund listened with attention that suggested real interest rather than polite forbearance. In turn, he spoke of responsibilities weighing upon him, tenant families dependent on his stewardship, complexities of agricultural improvement, balancing tradition with progressive reform. Fiona recognized that his burdens were not so different from those her father bore as laird, merely expressed in English terms rather than Highland. Margaret, riding slightly behind, observed these developments with satisfaction. She had known both parties possessed depths that conventional society rarely permitted them to display. The excursion culminated at a prospect point overlooking the river valley. They dismounted to rest the horses, Simmons withdrawing to discreet distance while Margaret settled on a convenient bench within sight but out of earshot. Edmund and Fiona stood at the overlook, their conversation having reached comfortable silence that occurs between people who have moved beyond mere acquaintance. The wind caught her copper curls. Several had inevitably escaped and sent them dancing. She made no attempt to restrain them, apparently unconcerned with dishevelment that would have mortified an English miss. He found himself studying her profile, the strong jawline, the way her green eyes surveyed landscape with intensity. She was so different from the young ladies his mother paraded before him. Different in appearance, certainly, but more fundamentally different in her entire approach to existence. She was authentic in a way that London society seemed designed to suppress. Fiona, feeling his gaze, turned to meet it directly. She inquired whether he was cataloguing her flaws for future amusement, as she had observed several ladies at the ball examining her through quizzing glasses as though she were an exotic museum specimen. Edmund responded that he had been thinking how refreshing it was to converse with someone who did not filter every thought through layers of artifice. Most ladies presented themselves as they believed men wished them to be, rather than as they actually were. This prompted Fiona to launch into impassioned discourse on the tyranny of social expectations. Marriage, she declared, was merely legal servitude dressed in romantic rhetoric. Women traded independence, property, even their names for the dubious privilege of being some man's domestic manager. Edmund listened with growing fascination. He had encountered Wollstonecraft's arguments in abstract contexts, but never heard them expressed with such personal conviction. He observed carefully that not all marriages conformed to such grim patterns. His own parents had maintained genuine affection. Fiona softened marginally, admitting that her parents had apparently loved each other, though her mother's death in childbirth suggested the risks women bore. She had decided young that she would not follow that path, would not surrender the freedom her mother's governess had taught her to value. Edmund found himself arguing the other side. Perhaps marriage need not be the battlefield she described. Two people of compatible temperament might find partnership rather than dominance. Even as he spoke, he wondered whether he was articulating genuine belief or merely hope. Their conversation was interrupted by Margaret's tactful indication that they had lingered long enough. The return journey passed in contemplative quiet. Over the following weeks, Fiona found herself repeatedly encountering Lord Weatherby in circumstances that stretched coincidence. He appeared at the lending library the same afternoon she visited. They discovered themselves admiring roses in Thornfield's garden when Margaret claimed urgent need to consult the housekeeper. He attended a musical evening where Fiona had been prevailed upon to sing Highland ballads. Margaret, when questioned about these fortuitous encounters, maintained wide-eyed innocence. That she had mentioned which afternoons Fiona visited the library or ensured Edmund received invitations to the vicarage. These were merely friendly courtesies, certainly nothing so calculating as matchmaking. The library encounter proved particularly significant. Fiona had been searching shelves for poetry when a hand appeared above her own and retrieved the volume she sought. Edmund presented the book, observing that Andrew Marvell was rather intense reading for a lady. Fiona informed him tartly that she was perfectly capable of handling intensity, and that she found intellectualism of metaphysical poetry far more engaging than vapid sentiments of popular romance. This sparked discussion of poetic merit that continued for nearly an hour, conducted in hushed voices, but with intensity suggesting they were debating matters of life and death. They discovered shared admiration for certain poets and passionate disagreement about others. The library's proprietor had never witnessed such animated literary debate. He watched with amazement as the Scottish Miss and English Viscount effectively forgot his existence. It was during this conversation that both experienced unsettling recognition. They had found something rare, a partner capable of matching their thoughts and making them think rather than merely respond. Such connections were uncommon in any sphere, particularly in their rigidly stratified world. The musical evening at the vicarage revealed another dimension. The vicar's wife requested Highland music. Fiona initially refused. Performing felt too much like displaying herself for English amusement. Margaret pleaded, and Fiona capitulated, though she made clear she would sing only in Gaelic. The company expected quaint folk melody. What Fiona delivered was traditional lament sung in Gaelic with voice that carried technical excellence and profound emotional weight. The song told of love lost and Highland glory faded, and though few understood the words, emotional content transcended language. The vicar, a man not prone to sentimentalism, was seen discreetly wiping the corner of his eye, and even the affected Miss Arabella Sterling lowered her fan, her mocking smile replaced by an expression of genuine wonder. Edmund, watching from his seat, felt something shift fundamentally in his chest. She stood in the room's center, copper hair catching candlelight, and poured out her heart in a tongue he did not speak, but somehow understood. There was no artifice in her performance. She simply gave everything to the music. When the final note faded, the room remained quiet before erupting into applause. Edmund approached her afterward and spoke words that surprised them both. He observed that her song had been achingly beautiful, that she must miss Scotland terribly, and that England was perhaps not irredeemable if it had brought her here where they might meet. Fiona looked at him with changeable eyes, currently more gold than green, and felt her defenses begin to crack. This was dangerous. This was precisely what she had sworn to avoid. Yet when Edmund asked whether she might consent to another excursion, to view Abbey ruins in the neighboring valley, she found herself agreeing. These developing connections, however, could not pass unnoticed in the small world of rural Derbyshire society. The Dowager Viscountess had been monitoring her son's activities with vigilance. She had noted the library visit, heard reports of the vicarage performance, received detailed intelligence about every encounter. Her response was swift and surgical. She began hosting afternoon gatherings, timed to conflict with Fiona's presence in public spaces. She arranged for Edmund to escort Miss Felicity to a county assembly. Most effectively, she launched a whisper campaign that spread through the district like invisible smoke. The whispers were carefully crafted to seem concerned rather than malicious. What were Miss McAllister's actual connections? Her father was merely a Highland laird, barely gentry by English standards. What was her portion? Certainly inadequate for a viscountess. And her behavior, so direct, so unrefined, so inappropriate for someone of true quality. These suggestions found fertile ground among families who had invested years attempting to secure Lord Edmund for their daughters. Lady Haversham remarked that Highland Scots were known for uncertain tempers. Mrs. Pennington observed that Miss McAllister's complexion suggested unfortunate exposure to elements. Fiona, isolated by language and custom, knew nothing of these machinations. She continued her daily existence, alternating between frustration at English conventions and reluctant admission that certain aspects possessed unexpected compensations. Chief among these was the growing connection with Lord Edmund. Margaret observed these developments with mixed satisfaction and concern. Her romantic heart delighted in the obvious attraction developing. Her practical mind recognized formidable obstacles. The Dowager Viscountess was a woman of considerable influence and implacable will. Fiona's father would never consent to his daughter marrying an Englishman. And society itself had begun turning against the Scottish girl with subtle cruelty, at which polite company excelled. Yet Margaret had observed something others perhaps missed. The way Edmund's habitual mask slipped when Fiona was present, revealing genuine emotion. And she had noticed how Fiona found excuses to be in places where she might encounter him. These were not the actions of people immune to each other's presence. The pivotal event occurred during an organized picnic at Ashford Abbey ruins, arranged ostensibly as a party for multiple families, but orchestrated by Margaret with her habitual romantic cunning. The ancient stones occupied a scenic spot beside a stream winding through wooded grounds. The company included Edmund and his mother, the Worthingtons with Miss Felicity, several other local families, along with Fiona and Margaret. The afternoon progressed with usual picnic activities, elaborate spreads laid out on blankets, gentlemen handing ladies down from carriages. After the meal, when the party dispersed for exploration of ruins, Edmund, with Margaret's assistance, managed to find himself walking with Fiona among broken columns and crumbling walls, nominally chaperoned but with sufficient privacy for actual conversation. They discussed the history, monks who had inhabited these walls, violence of the dissolution, the way time and nature reclaimed human constructions. The conversation moved from historical facts to philosophical reflection. Fiona spoke of stone circles in the Highlands, places that had stood for thousands of years. She wondered what drove ancient builders to move massive stones without modern machinery. Edmund responded with observations about human need for permanence, for creating something that would outlast individual mortality. It was then, standing among ruins testifying to transience, that Edmund found himself speaking with uncharacteristic vulnerability. He confessed that he had spent most of his adult life fulfilling obligations he had not chosen, meeting expectations established by others, wondering whether his existence would be merely a series of proper performances. Meeting someone who lived authentically rather than appropriately had shown him possibilities he had not previously considered. Fiona, disarmed by this honesty, found her defenses weakening. She acknowledged that her fierce independence stemmed partly from fear of losing herself in someone else's expectations, fear of becoming merely a legal extension of a husband's identity, fear of dying as her mother had died. For several moments they stood in silence, two people who had accidentally revealed more than intended. The air between them felt charged with possibility and danger. Edmund reached out and touched one of the copper curls that had escaped its pins. Fiona found herself frozen, caught between competing desires. The moment shattered with the approach of the Dowager Viscountess, who had been monitoring her son's location with predatory attention. She appeared with Miss Felicity in tow, suggesting with pointed courtesy that perhaps Lord Weatherby might escort Miss Worthington through the remainder of the ruins. The Dowager's cold gaze swept over Fiona with aristocratic dismissiveness. The message was clear without requiring articulation. A Highland girl with inadequate connections had no business monopolizing an English viscount's attention. Edmund complied with his mother's directive with automatic obedience, though his expression suggested internal conflict. He bowed to Fiona, promised to continue their conversation later, and departed with Miss Worthington. Fiona stood alone among broken stones, feeling something that might have been anger or hurt, or simply bitter confirmation of what she had always known, that English society would never accept her, and that whatever connection she felt with Edmund could not survive the weight of expectation defining his world. Margaret found her cousin shortly thereafter, still standing amid ruins with an expression suggesting internal battle. The older woman took Fiona's arm with gentle understanding and steered her back toward the main party. The weeks following the picnic passed in suspended tension. Edmund continued his required social obligations, escorting Miss Felicity and Miss Arabella to various functions while his mother watched with satisfaction. Yet those who knew him well noticed a quality of distraction in his performance. Fiona threw herself into what she termed educational obligations, spending hours in Thornfield's library, absorbing English literature with the same intensity she brought to all endeavors. She told herself she was making productive use of her exile. She did not admit she was attempting to distract her mind from thoughts of a certain gentleman and the way her pulse had quickened when he touched her curls among the ruins. Lady Margaret, observing both parties, decided the situation required more direct intervention. She arranged for her husband's extensive library to require cataloging, a task necessitating expert assistance. Lord Edmund, known for his own impressive collection, was invited to advise. The first day of cataloguing found Edmund and Fiona alone in Thornfield's library, alone save for Margaret's occasional appearances with refreshments and questions requiring briefer responses than their frequency suggested. The library was handsome, 2 stories tall with a gallery accessible by spiral stair. They began with careful politeness, aware that something significant had shifted between them, but uncertain how to address it. Edmund recommended systems of organization. Fiona countered with alternative arrangements. Their debates possessed the surface structure of academic discussion, but carried undertones of everything not directly addressed. As morning progressed toward afternoon, they gradually relaxed into easier rapport. They discovered mutual admiration for certain obscure authors and shared disdain for popular but intellectually shallow works. Edmund revealed surprising familiarity with Scottish literature. Fiona, examining a particularly fine Shakespeare edition, spoke of how her mother's governess had taught her to read using the plays. Miss Pemberton had believed good literature transcended gender and station. Edmund responded that he had experienced similar education through his father, a man who valued learning for its own sake. They had read together in the very study where Edmund now managed a state business. His father's death had felt like losing an intellectual companion. This revelation of mutual loss created unexpected intimacy. They found themselves sharing memories previously kept private, speaking of grief and loneliness, with candor neither typically permitted. Fiona described her isolation in the Highlands, surrounded by people who thought her odd. Edmund admitted his own isolation in drawing rooms full of people, performing expected roles while feeling fundamentally alone. The space between them had gradually diminished. How they had unconsciously moved closer while reaching for volumes. How their hands briefly touched when passing books. These small physical proximities, entirely innocent yet charged with significance, accumulated like kindling a waiting spark. It was during examination of a particularly valuable manuscript depicting courtly love conventions that the carefully maintained boundaries finally collapsed. They stood side by side at the library table, heads bent over ancient pages, their shoulders nearly touching. Edmund was explaining the symbolism when Fiona suddenly looked up and their faces were mere inches apart. For several heartbeats, neither moved, caught in that suspended moment. Edmund's gaze dropped to Fiona's mouth, then lifted to her eyes, seeking permission or encouragement, or perhaps simply confirmation he was not alone in what he felt. Fiona, her usual fierce independence momentarily dissolved, found herself leaning infinitesimally closer. The kiss, when it occurred, possessed the inevitable quality of water flowing downhill. Natural, unstoppable, somehow always meant to happen. It was not a polite brush of lips, but rather a kiss that contained all the weeks of accumulated tension. Edmund's hand came up to cradle Fiona's face, his thumb tracing her jaw. Fiona's fingers gripped his coat lapels as though anchoring herself. They broke apart simultaneously, both shocked by the intensity. The library now seemed to vibrate with dangerous energy. They stood staring at each other, breathing heavily, the weight of social transgression settling upon them. Edmund recovered first, though his composure had been thoroughly shattered. He began to speak, stopped, struggled to find adequate words. He finally managed that he had not intended, that is, he had not planned, but he could not in honesty pretend to regret what had just happened, though he understood it was entirely inappropriate. Fiona, discovering that Highland directness served as well in aftermath as in confrontation, cut through his stammering. She observed that she had participated quite actively in the kiss, that she was not some delicate English flower requiring smelling salts, and that while the action had been improper, it had not been entirely unwelcome. This forthright response drew from Edmund something between a laugh and a groan. He acknowledged that her honesty was both refreshing and utterly unnerving, that he was accustomed to ladies who fainted at impropriety rather than discussing it rationally. They stood in awkward silence, both acutely aware that what had occurred changed everything while simultaneously changing nothing. In their world, a stolen kiss possessed serious consequences, particularly for the lady involved. Edmund, drawing upon reserves of honor, made a formal statement of his feelings. He confessed that he had found himself thinking of Fiona at inappropriate moments, during estate business, at social functions, in quiet hours before dawn. He admitted that her intelligence, her authenticity, her fierce independence attracted him precisely because these were qualities that made him feel more alive. He was not seeking a viscountess to manage his house, but a partner who would challenge him not to lose himself in his own obligations. He confessed that, observing her, he saw a reflection of the person he feared he had lost within himself. He was not proposing marriage. Such a declaration required more consideration. But he wanted her to understand his interest was not merely casual attraction. Fiona listened with emotions so tangled she could scarcely separate them. Part of her wanted to flee, but another part recognized that Edmund had somehow penetrated defenses she had considered impregnable. He did not seek to change her or tame her. He seemed to value precisely the qualities that made her unmarriageable by conventional standards. Yet she could not ignore practical realities. She was a Highland Scot with inadequate dowry and unconventional temperament, sworn to return to Scotland at summer's end. He was an English viscount with extensive responsibilities and a mother who clearly considered Fiona wholly unsuitable. Even if they both developed deeper feelings, the barriers separating them remained insurmountable. She spoke these thoughts aloud, her voice steady despite internal turmoil. She acknowledged the connection between them, admitted it was stronger than anticipated, but insisted that reality must govern possibility. She had made vows regarding marriage that she did not make lightly. He had obligations to family and position that would not accommodate a wife society considered inappropriate. Edmund listened with growing frustration, recognizing truth in her words while resenting their inexorability. He wanted to argue that feelings should override social considerations. Yet even as these romantic notions formed, he heard his mother's voice reciting genealogies, felt the weight of the Ashford name. Margaret's arrival with tea and tactful observation that they had spent sufficient time among dusty books interrupted them. The tea that followed possessed surreal quality. 3 people making polite conversation about inconsequential matters, while one participant still felt the impression of another's lips. Edmund departed shortly thereafter with appropriate courtesies and a final look toward Fiona, containing volumes of unspoken complexity. The crisis, when it arrived, came from the toxic combination of family pressure and social manipulation. The Dowager Viscountess, having observed her son's continued attention toward the Scottish girl with mounting alarm, decided subtle methods had proven insufficient. She began her campaign with Edmund himself, conducting conversations designed to remind him of his responsibilities. Did he not understand that the Ashford line required strengthening through advantageous alliance? Could he not see that his choice of wife would affect the entire estate? Had he forgotten that his father's dying wish had been to see the family name continue with honor? These arguments, deployed with maternal knowledge of vulnerabilities, found their mark. Edmund had been raised to value duty above personal preference. His mother's words awakened guilt that had been temporarily suppressed. When maternal persuasion proved only partially effective, the Dowager employed more ruthless tactics. She arranged for Edmund to overhear a conversation, entirely staged, in which she discussed with Lady Haversham the unfortunate situation of young ladies who fancied themselves above their station. The Scottish girl clearly harbored hopes inappropriate to her circumstances. It was almost cruel for a gentleman of Edmund's position to encourage such fantasies when everyone knew he must eventually marry someone suitable. The poison worked its intended effect. Edmund, who had been contemplating courting Fiona seriously despite obstacles, found himself questioning whether his attention had been unfair to her. If society would never accept such a match, was he not merely toying with her affections? The notion that his interest might harm her reputation troubled his conscience deeply. Simultaneously, the Dowager launched her assault on Fiona through different channels. She ensured certain information reached Margaret in ways that appeared accidental. It was mentioned that Lord Edmund had been seen frequently with Miss Arabella Sterling, that the Sterling family expected an announcement shortly, and that the Dowager had commissioned renovations to the Viscountess's apartments in anticipation of a new bride. Margaret, who lacked sophistication to recognize deliberate manipulation, relayed these developments to Fiona with obvious distress. She added that perhaps Edmund's attentions had merely been idle amusement before fulfilling actual obligations. Fiona received this intelligence with the stoicism of someone whose worst expectations have been confirmed. Of course, the English Viscount had been merely passing time with the odd Scottish girl. Of course, his interest had been superficial. She had known this from the beginning, yet somehow the defenses she had constructed proved inadequate against actual pain. Her response was to retreat into fierce independence. She informed Margaret icily that she had never expected anything different, that she had warned everyone she would not be trapped into marriage, and that she wanted nothing more than to return immediately to Scotland. She demanded that Margaret write to her father requesting permission for early departure. Margaret, horrified, begged Fiona to wait, to speak with Edmund, to allow time for clarification. Fiona refused with Highland stubbornness. She had endured sufficient humiliation and would not compound it by appearing to pursue a gentleman who had already moved on to more suitable prospects. The following days saw both parties suffering in isolation, each convinced the other had retreated due to superior wisdom or social necessity. Edmund, believing he had been selfish in encouraging Fiona's interest when society would never accept their union, forced himself to attend functions with Miss Arabella. Fiona, convinced Edmund had never seriously considered her beyond momentary diversion, began preparations for departure while maintaining rigid pride. It was precisely this mutual misunderstanding, each believing they were acting in the other's best interest by withdrawing, that brought matters to crisis. The mechanism was the Midsummer Assembly, an annual event attracting families from across the district. Edmund attended under maternal orders, escorting Miss Arabella with habitual courtesy, while feeling nothing beyond polite indifference. Fiona attended despite her preference to remain at Thornfield, dragged by Margaret, who insisted she could not depart England without attending at least one proper assembly. Neither anticipated encountering the other. The assembly took place at the Assembly Rooms, a handsome building erected specifically to accommodate social requirements. Fiona, wearing a gown of deep emerald that Margaret had commissioned, drew attention as she always did. She held herself with fierce pride, determined to demonstrate that the Scottish girl possessed dignity regardless of English opinion. Edmund saw her the moment she entered, felt the familiar constriction in his chest, and immediately looked away. He had resolved that for her sake, he would maintain appropriate distance. He asked Miss Arabella to dance with determined courtesy, suggesting duty rather than desire. Fiona observed this request with something that felt like physical pain. She had told herself repeatedly that Edmund meant nothing, that whatever had occurred in the library had been momentary foolishness. Yet seeing him smile at another woman, bow over her hand, lead her onto the dance floor, these ordinary courtesies felt like confirmation of every bitter suspicion. The crisis arrived during the supper interval. Edmund found himself cornered by his mother and Lady Haversham, who discussed his marital prospects with astonishing frankness. The Dowager observed, just loudly enough to be overheard, that she was so pleased to see Edmund attending to appropriate young ladies after his unfortunate distraction with that odd Scottish girl. Lady Haversham agreed that Highland blood always showed itself eventually, and thank goodness Lord Edmund had seen reason. These words, designed to reach Fiona's ears, achieved their objective with devastating efficiency. Fiona, standing near enough to overhear, felt something break inside her chest. She had believed, despite all wisdom, that perhaps Edmund's interest had been genuine. The realization that she had been merely a distraction felt like confirmation of every bitter lesson. She departed the refreshment room immediately, seeking escape before emotion could overcome Highland pride. Margaret followed with concern. She found Fiona in an anteroom, standing rigid with posture of someone holding themselves together through sheer will. When Margaret attempted comfort, Fiona cut her off with words edged like broken glass. She had been a fool to believe anything in England could be different. She had let down her guard, permitted herself to imagine possibilities, and had been reminded why she had constructed those defenses. She demanded that they leave immediately. Meanwhile, Edmund had finally reached the limits of his endurance. He listened to his mother disparage Fiona with mounting fury and suddenly understood what he had been too blind to see. His mother's guidance had been manipulation. Her concern for his welfare masked concern for her own vision of family continuity. She did not care about his happiness, only about his conformity. More significantly, he recognized that in attempting to protect Fiona from social censure, he had inflicted the very wound he sought to prevent. He had withdrawn his attention, avoided her company, allowed others to believe he considered her unsuitable. Instead, he had confirmed every bitter expectation her previous experiences had created. For an instant, the weight of centuries of duty paralyzed him. The Ashford lineage, his father's dying wish, his mother's devotion, all clamored for obedience. But then Fiona's face rose in his mind, not as a distraction, but as a promise of an authentic future. He realized that the greatest betrayal to his name would not be marrying a Scottish girl without title, but rather allowing the Ashford name to become synonymous with a life lived in fear. And in that instant, duty realigned with desire. He made his decision. He would not permit his mother to dictate his life's most important choice. He would not sacrifice genuine connection for social approval. He would not lose Fiona without at least attempting to correct the terrible misunderstanding his cowardice had created. He excused himself from his mother's company with finality that made her eyes narrow in alarm. He went in search of Miss McAllister with determination. He found the anteroom empty, Margaret and Fiona having already departed for Thornfield Manor. His inquiries confirmed his worst fears. Miss McAllister had requested immediate departure, had appeared greatly distressed, and had been heard to mention returning to Scotland as soon as arrangements could be made. Edmund stood in the emptying assembly rooms and understood with crystalline clarity that he had perhaps just lost the only person who had made him feel authentically alive in years. The recognition arrived too late, leaving him with nothing but bitter taste of opportunity squandered and determination to remedy matters if remedy remained possible. Dawn arrived at Thornfield Manor to find Fiona already awake. She had made her decision during long, dark hours. She would return to Scotland immediately, would reclaim the life she had temporarily abandoned, would prove she needed neither England nor Englishmen. Margaret, entering her cousin's chamber at an earlier hour than usual, found Fiona directing her maid in packing trunks with military efficiency. The sight filled Margaret with despair. Margaret's attempts at persuasion, suggesting that perhaps matters were not as they appeared, that misunderstandings occurred, met the immovable force of Highland stubbornness. Fiona informed her cousin that she appreciated the hospitality, but that her father would surely grant permission for early return. She had fulfilled her obligation to attempt English society. That the attempt had failed surprised no one. What Fiona did not confess was the depth of pain Edmund's apparent betrayal had caused. She had armored herself against exactly this outcome, yet somehow he had penetrated defenses she had considered impenetrable. The library kiss, the hours of genuine conversation, the way he had looked at her, these memories now felt like elaborate deceptions. As Fiona supervised the dismantling of her temporary English life, Lord Edmund was conducting a very different morning. He had departed Wetherby Hall before his mother rose, leaving a brief note that he had urgent business requiring immediate attention. The urgent business consisted of riding to Thornfield Manor with desperate hope that he might intercept Fiona before pride placed her beyond reach. He arrived as the stable clock struck 9, his horse lathered from the pace. Edmund dismounted and strode toward Thornfield's entrance with determination. Margaret, alerted by the sound of arrival, appeared at the door with expression combining hope and apprehension. She informed Lord Edmund that Miss McAllister was indeed preparing for departure, that she had been adamant in her refusal to reconsider. However, she added with meaningful look, perhaps a gentleman of Lord Edmund's standing might prove more persuasive. Edmund requested whether he might be permitted to speak with Miss McAllister privately, or as privately as propriety permitted. Margaret assured him that she would remain in the room as chaperone, but would position herself by the window, occupied with needlework, and hear absolutely nothing that transpired across the room. Fiona descended some minutes later, summoned by Margaret with information that Lord Edmund had called and requested audience. She had considered refusing, but curiosity compelled her to agree. She entered the morning room with defenses fully engaged, prepared for polite farewell or perhaps apology. What she encountered instead was a man who looked as though he had wrestled demons through the night. Edmund's usual grooming showed signs of haste, his cravat less precisely tied, his expression suggesting he had abandoned the social mask. He looked rather as she felt, exhausted, hurt, desperately hoping for something he feared was impossible. They regarded each other across the morning room with wariness of wounded creatures, uncertain whether they faced friend or foe. Margaret made a great show of settling by the window with embroidery, humming softly to demonstrate complete inattention. Edmund began to speak, stopped, discovered that rehearsed words proved inadequate. He started again, abandoning rehearsed speeches for raw honesty. He confessed that he had been a coward and a fool. He acknowledged that in attempting to protect her from social censure, he had inflicted the very wounds he sought to prevent. He admitted that his mother's manipulations, which he had been too blind to recognize, had convinced him that his interest could only damage Fiona's reputation. He had withdrawn not from lack of feeling, but from misguided attempt to spare her pain. Fiona listened with expression revealing nothing, though her hands gripped her skirts with enough force to crease fabric. When Edmund paused, she spoke with characteristic directness. She observed that his explanation, however eloquent, changed nothing material. He remained an English viscount with responsibilities. She remained a Highland Scot with inadequate connections. His mother would never accept such a match. Her father would consider it betrayal. Society would ridicule them both. Edmund acknowledged the truth of these observations, then posed a question that made Margaret abandon all pretense of inattention. He asked whether those practical obstacles actually mattered if two people had found genuine connection, mutual respect, and the possibility of building a life based on partnership rather than polite indifference. This was a revolutionary question for a gentleman of his station. He was essentially suggesting that individual happiness might supersede social obligation, that authentic feeling might matter more than appropriate alliance. Fiona felt something shift in her chest, not complete dissolution of defenses, but perhaps the first crack in walls she had thought impenetrable. She reminded him that she had sworn vows regarding marriage, that she had proclaimed herself content with spinsterhood, that she had publicly rejected the notion that women required husbands. Edmund's response demonstrated why he had managed to penetrate her defenses when others had failed. He observed that he was not suggesting she required a husband, but rather that he required her. He was not proposing that she conform to society's expectations of wifehood, but rather hoping she might consider partnership with someone who valued precisely the qualities that made her unmarriageable by conventional standards: her intelligence, her independence, her refusal to perform femininity as drawing rooms demanded. He admitted he could not promise their life would be easy or socially comfortable. His mother would oppose the match with every weapon at her disposal. Society would whisper and speculate and likely ostracize them, but he could promise honesty, respect, and the sort of genuine regard that seemed infinitely more valuable than polite tolerance. Fiona stood silent, feeling the weight of competing desires and obligations. Part of her wanted to refuse, to prove that she meant what she said about not requiring masculine validation. But another part recognized that accepting help or partnership or even love did not necessarily constitute betrayal of self. She spoke then with vulnerability she rarely permitted, confessing that she had indeed felt connection between them, that the library kiss had not been momentary foolishness, but revelation of something genuine, and that his apparent withdrawal had wounded her more deeply than she had believed possible. She admitted that her vehement rejection of marriage stemmed partly from fear, not merely fear of legal bondage, but fear of losing herself in someone else's expectations. Edmund listened with complete attention, then offered a response that would prove decisive. He acknowledged that her fears were neither irrational nor unfounded. The law did indeed render married women legally subordinate. He could not change those laws, but he could promise that their private reality would differ from legal fiction, that he would value her mind and respect her autonomy, that he sought partner rather than possession. This was as close to a marriage proposal as propriety permitted without formal arrangements. Edmund was essentially asking whether Fiona would consider abandoning her sworn spinsterhood for the possibility of partnership with him, despite all the practical obstacles. Fiona's response came not in words, but in the softening of her rigid posture, the easing of her defensive expression. She informed him that she would not give him an answer immediately. She was not some fluttering miss who required masculine rescue. She would need time to consider whether violating her vows constituted growth or merely weakness. But she would delay her departure from England long enough to make that consideration properly. This conditional acceptance, grudging though it was, filled Edmund with profound relief. He bowed over her hand with genuine gratitude, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that recalled the library kiss. He promised to give her whatever time she required, though he hoped she understood that his own feelings were quite decided. Margaret, abandoning all pretense of needlework, actually applauded from her window seat. Fiona shot her cousin a look that should have quelled such enthusiasm, but actually contained traces of reluctant amusement. The following days brought subtle shift. Fiona did not resume packing, though neither did she fully unpack. She existed in a state of suspended decision, using the time Edmund had promised to examine her own feelings with intellectual rigor she brought to all important matters. Edmund spent those days preparing for the confrontation he knew must come. His mother had noted his distraction, his continued absences from social obligations, had begun making pointed inquiries. He knew that when he finally informed her of his intentions regarding Fiona, the resulting conflict would test their relationship in ways neither had previously experienced. The revelation occurred over dinner at Weatherby Hall on a Thursday evening. The Dowager Viscountess had been describing latest developments regarding Miss Arabella's family, clearly expecting Edmund to show interest. Instead, he interrupted her mid-sentence with a declaration that made her fork halt. He informed her that he intended to propose marriage to Miss Fiona McAllister of Glen Carrick, and that he hoped his mother would eventually come to accept such a match. The silence that followed possessed a quality that Footman would later describe as terrifying. The dowager's face progressed through shades of emotion, shock, disbelief, fury, before settling into cold rage more frightening than explosive anger. She began her response with icy precision, reminding Edmund of his responsibilities to the Ashford name, the expectations of his position, the real consequences of choosing inappropriately. The Scottish girl possessed no connections worth mentioning, no fortune sufficient for a viscountess, and no understanding of the role she would fulfill. Moreover, her temperament, outspoken, unconventional, lacking in proper feminine delicacy, would make her a laughingstock. Edmund listened with growing resolve rather than weakening conviction. When his mother paused, he responded with words he had never before directed at her. He acknowledged his responsibilities, but suggested those included his own welfare and happiness. He observed that the Ashford name would not be strengthened by a loveless marriage to a woman he respected but did not love, and he noted that she had spent 5 years managing his marital prospects according to her own vision rather than his actual needs. The dowager's response escalated into threats. If he persisted, she would make certain that society knew exactly what to think of the Highland upstart. She would ensure that every door in London closed to them both. she would consider him to have betrayed his father's memory and her own years of devotion. Edmund felt these barbs strike home, particularly the invocation of his father's memory. Yet he had been thinking extensively about what his father would actually have wanted. The man who had valued learning and genuine discourse above social climbing would have understood his son's choice. The dinner concluded in hostile silence, with the dowager withdrawing to her private apartments and Edmund retiring to his study, where he poured himself more brandy than was strictly wise and contemplated the wreckage of his familial peace. Yet even with his mother's threats echoing, he found his resolve unchanged. Fiona had shown him possibilities: genuine partnership, intellectual companionship, life based on mutual respect rather than convenient arrangement. He would fight for that possibility, even if it cost him his mother's approval and society's good opinion. The Dowager Viscountess, denied victory and private confrontation, began her public campaign with strategic precision. She hosted afternoon gatherings where she expressed concern that her poor son had been ensnared by a scheming Highland girl who had calculated precisely how to exploit masculine weakness. She wondered aloud whether Miss McAllister's proclaimed independence had been merely performance designed to intrigue gentlemen bored with conventional femininity. These poisonous suggestions found ready audience among those whose matrimonial campaigns had been disrupted. Lady Havisham expressed shocked sympathy. Mrs. Pennington declared she had suspected ulterior motives. Even families who had shown Fiona previous courtesy began withdrawing recognition. Margaret reported these developments to Fiona with genuine distress. The social atmosphere had turned actively hostile. Morning calls ceased. Invitations were quietly withdrawn. When Margaret and Fiona ventured into the village, conversations stopped as they approached. Fiona endured this treatment with outward Highland pride, though privately she felt the isolation keenly. She began to wonder whether accepting Edmund's proposal would merely trap them both in permanent exile. It was during this period that Edmund demonstrated the depth of his commitment through actions rather than merely words. He appeared at Thornfield Manor daily, entirely unconcerned that his continued visits during Fiona's social disgrace would damage his own reputation. He walked with her in the gardens while servants whispered. He sat with her in the library discussing poetry while the Tun decided he had lost his senses. He made certain that anyone observing would understand his intentions were serious and his regard undiminished by public opinion. These visits provided Fiona with evidence more compelling than any verbal assurances. Edmund was not merely professing commitment in private, he was demonstrating it publicly despite considerable cost. His mother had essentially ceased speaking to him beyond frigid necessities. His friends among the local gentry had begun making excuses, unwilling to be associated with someone who had defied social expectations so dramatically. Yet he continued calling as though unaware he was burning bridges with every visit. It was during one such visit, as they walked among Margaret's roses in late afternoon light, that Fiona finally articulated the decision she had been approaching for days. She informed Edmund that she had been a fool to imagine she could maintain her sworn spinsterhood when confronted with genuine partnership. She acknowledged that her vows had been defensive rather than aspirational, constructed to protect against disappointment rather than to celebrate authentic independence. She confessed that what frightened her most was not the loss of independence itself, but rather the vulnerability that came with caring deeply about another person's welfare and opinion. Highland pride had taught her to need no one, to rely only upon herself. Edmund was asking her to abandon that isolation, to accept that interdependence need not equal weakness, and to believe that he would honor his promises even when legal and social structures permitted him to violate them with impunity. Edmund listened with complete attention, then responded with equal honesty. He admitted that he shared her fear of vulnerability, that his own careful social mask had been constructed to protect against disappointments. He acknowledged that marriage would require trust from them both. He made his formal proposal then, there among the roses with summer sun turning Fiona's copper hair to flame. He asked whether she would consent to be his wife, to build with him a marriage that honored both their fears and hopes, and to face together whatever social consequences their choice provoked. He promised to value her mind, respect her independence, and never require her to become something she was not. Fiona's acceptance, when it came, was complicated by tears she rarely permitted herself, tears containing relief and fear and hope and resignation to the fact that she had apparently fallen in love despite every intention to avoid such vulnerability. She agreed to marry him, but only if he understood she would continue being exactly as obstinate and unconventional as she had always been, and that if he imagined marriage would soften her edges or tame her spirit, he would be severely disappointed. Edmund's response was to kiss her quite thoroughly despite the possibility of being observed, then to inform her that her obstinate unconventionality was precisely why he loved her, and that attempting to change those qualities would be like attempting to stop the Highland wind, both futile and undesirable. Margaret, who had indeed been observing from a discreet window, actually wept with joy. She had believed from the beginning that her cousin and Lord Edmund were suited in ways that transcended social convention. The formal announcement of the engagement, however, provoked the crisis everyone had been anticipating. The Dowager Viscountess, learning of her son's determination to proceed, attempted one final devastating intervention. She wrote to Laird Duncan McAllister in Scotland, informing him that his daughter had trapped an English nobleman through calculated performance, and suggesting that perhaps the Laird might wish to intervene before his family name suffered additional disgrace. This letter nearly succeeded in its objective. Laird Duncan, already displeased that his daughter had apparently abandoned her proclaimed principles, dispatched a furious missive demanding that Fiona return to Scotland immediately and cease bringing dishonor upon the McAllister name. He would not consent to her marriage to an Englishman under any circumstances, and she could consider herself effectively disowned if she proceeded. This paternal rejection struck Fiona with force she had not anticipated. She had expected her father's disapproval, but the cold finality of actual disownment felt like losing the last connection to her Highland identity. She stood in the library, her father's letter crumpled in her hand, and understood that choosing Edmund would require her to sacrifice more than she had fully comprehended. Edmund found her there some hours later, still holding the letter. He read the contents with rising fury, not at Fiona, but at the adults who seemed determined to sacrifice their children's happiness to preserve their own visions of propriety. His mother's interference had created this crisis, and he would ensure she understood the consequences. He made a decision that would prove decisive. He would force a public confrontation at the venue where his mother possessed greatest influence, and he faced maximum risk: the upcoming Midsummer Ball at Wetherby Hall itself, the annual event marking the social pinnacle of the provincial season. He would announce his engagement publicly, in his mother's own ballroom, before an assembly of everyone whose opinion she valued. And he would make certain that Fiona understood he chose her not despite social cost, but because she mattered more than social approval. Fiona initially refused to participate. She would not be the cause of irrevocable breach between Edmund and his mother. She would not force him to choose between filial duty and romantic attachment. Edmund's response was to point out that the choice had already been made. His mother had forced confrontation through her interference with Fiona's father. The only question remaining was whether they would face these challenges together or separately, and Edmund had no intention of facing them separately. The week before the Midsummer Ball passed in tense preparation. Margaret threw herself into ensuring Fiona possessed appropriate attire, commissioning a gown in deep crimson silk that would ensure she could not be overlooked. Edmund made careful arrangements, consulting with allies he still possessed, and ensuring the evening would proceed according to his specifications. The Dowager Viscountess, aware that something was planned but unable to determine precise details, attempted to have the ball cancelled. Edmund informed her calmly that as the Viscount and Master of Wetherby Hall, he would determine which social functions were hosted, and the Midsummer Ball would proceed. This quiet assertion of authority marked a fundamental shift in household power dynamics. The evening arrived with weather that seemed calculated to match dramatic events. a summer storm gathering on the horizon, air heavy with anticipation. Weatherby Hall blazed with candlelight, the ballroom decorated with elaborate arrangements. The assembled company represented the cream of Derbyshire society, entirely unaware they were about to witness a social earthquake. Fiona descended from the carriage with Margaret at a fashionably late hour. Her gown of crimson silk was cut in latest London style, though on her frame it suggested Highland pride rather than English conformity. Her copper hair had been dressed with jeweled combs, the arrangement more successful than usual, though rebellious curls still threatened escape. Most striking was her bearing. She entered not as a supplicant, hoping for acceptance, but as a woman who understood her own worth regardless of others' assessment. The whispers began immediately, rippling through the ballroom. The Scottish girl had dared to attend despite the Dowager Viscountess's known opposition. She walked through the assembled company with Highland pride. Some ladies actually turned their backs as Fiona passed, the cut direct delivered with coordinated cruelty. Margaret, walking beside her cousin, felt fury at this treatment, but noted with satisfaction that Fiona's expression revealed nothing beyond polite courtesy. The Scottish girl had been trained by 5 Highland rejections and weeks of English ostracism. She would not grant these people the satisfaction of visible distress. Edmund, positioned near the entrance specifically to intercept Fiona's arrival, stepped forward immediately. He bowed over her hand with public courtesy that made his intentions unmistakable, then offered his arm to escort her properly into the ballroom. This gesture constituted declaration more effective than any verbal announcement. The Dowager Viscountess, holding court across the room with carefully selected allies, felt a furious heat rise up her neck, and a vein throbbed at her temple. She had hoped her son might yet see reason. Instead, he was publicly aligning himself with the Scottish girl before witnesses whose opinion he had previously valued. Edmund led Fiona through the crowd with deliberate slowness, ensuring every guest observed them together. He introduced her to families who had previously cut her acquaintance, his manner suggesting he expected courtesy and would notice its absence. Some responded with forced politeness, unwilling to offend the Viscount. Others maintained hostile distance, prioritizing the Dowager's approval. The orchestra was positioned in the gallery above, their music providing elegant backdrop to unfolding social drama. Edmund had coordinated with the Master of Ceremonies regarding the evening's program. The first dance would be a waltz, that slightly scandalous dance permitting closer contact, and Edmund intended to claim it with Fiona before the entire assembly. He made his request formally, his voice carrying to observers positioned nearby. Fiona accepted with equal formality, though her eyes revealed awareness of the significance. They took their positions as the orchestra began the opening measures, Edmund's hand settling at Fiona's waist, her gloved fingers resting on his shoulder. The waltz that followed became legendary for its emotional intensity. Edmund and Fiona moved through the figures, with synchronization of partners who understood each other beyond merely physical coordination. They maintained prescribed distance between their bodies, while their gazes communicated volumes that propriety prevented their mouths from expressing. The other couples on the floor faded into irrelevance as observers focused on the Viscount and his inappropriate choice. Watching two people dance who are genuinely in love possesses a quality that transcends technical execution. Edmund and Fiona moved together as though they had been doing so for years rather than weeks, their connection evident in every turn and progression. Those observing who possessed any romantic sensibility could not help but recognize authentic feeling. As the dance concluded, Edmund did not escort Fiona immediately from the floor as convention dictated. Instead, he retained her hand and turned to face the assembled company, with expression suggesting significant announcement was imminent. The orchestra, following prearranged instructions, ceased playing. The ballroom gradually quieted. As Edmund raised his hand for silence, the icy voice of his mother cut through the air. "Edmund," she said, with a clarity that reached every corner of the ballroom, "do not subject our guests to an embarrassing spectacle." Surely you have more consideration for your name." For a moment, a tense silence settled, every eye turning to Edmund, waiting to see whether he would retreat. It was against this direct challenge that he found his voice, clearer and more resolute than ever before. Edmund's words, when they came, carried to every corner with the clarity of someone who had made peace with his choice. He thanked the assembled guests for attending, acknowledged his mother's years of social leadership with courtesy that barely concealed their current estrangement, then proceeded to make the announcement that would define the evening. He declared that he had the honor of announcing his engagement to Miss Fiona McAllister of Glen Carrick. He acknowledged that some present might consider the match unusual, that Miss McAllister's Highland heritage and unconventional temperament differed from what Derbyshire society typically expected. However, he continued with growing confidence. He had discovered in Miss McAllister qualities infinitely more valuable than conventional appropriateness, intelligence that challenged him, authenticity that reminded him what genuine emotion resembled, and courage that inspired him to prioritize genuine happiness over comfortable conformity. He concluded by observing that he hoped those present would recognize the match for what it truly was, not a gentleman's foolish infatuation, but rather two people of compatible temperament choosing to build a life together based on partnership rather than duty. Those who could not accept Miss McAllister as his future wife were welcome to maintain their distance, but they should understand that he considered her worth more than all their collective approval. The silence that followed possessed an almost physical quality. The assembled company stood frozen in various attitudes of shock, curiosity, disapproval, or, in a few cases, grudging admiration. The Dowager Viscountess appeared ready to faint, or possibly commit violence. Lady Havisham clutched her fan as though it were a weapon. Mrs. Pennington's mouth hung open in unbecoming manner. Then, from the back of the ballroom, came the sound of a single person clapping. The applause came from Sir Thomas Willoughby, a widower known for his progressive politics and contempt for social pretension. He declared that it was about time someone in this bloodless district chose genuine feeling over genealogical calculation, and that he personally found the match infinitely more interesting than usual dreary alliances. His endorsement, coming from a man whose consequence exceeded even the Dowager's influence, shifted the social atmosphere marginally. Several other guests began tentative applause, unwilling to directly oppose Sir Thomas. The support remained far from universal. Many maintained disapproving silence, but the complete condemnation the Dowager had anticipated failed to materialize. Edmund, emboldened by this partial acceptance, made one final gesture calculated to demonstrate his commitment. He turned to Fiona, and before the entire assembled company, kissed her hand with tenderness that transcended prescribed courtesy. Then he spoke words intended for her alone, but delivered loudly enough for everyone to hear. He informed her that she had taught him what courage actually meant, that she had shown him how to value authentic self over social performance, and that he considered himself fortunate beyond measure that she had consented to risk her independence by binding her life to his. Fiona's response, delivered in Highland-accented English she had never attempted to soften, carried equal weight. She acknowledged that marriage terrified her still, that surrendering independence to partnership required trust she had spent years learning not to give. But Edmund had proven himself worthy through actions rather than merely words, and she would rather face an uncertain future with him than a safe, solitary existence without him. The ballroom erupted, not in universal approval, but in chaotic mixture of reaction. Some guests departed immediately in protest, Lady Havisham among them. Others remained, curiosity overcoming disapproval. A few brave souls actually approached to offer congratulations, though these remained decidedly in the minority. The Dowager Viscountess made her own dramatic exit, sweeping from the ballroom with an entourage of loyal supporters and declaration that she would retire to the Dower House indefinitely, as she clearly had no further place in her son's life. Edmund watched her departure with sorrow but no regret. He had offered her the choice between accepting his happiness and losing his daily presence, and she had chosen the latter. The engagement period that followed proved socially complicated but privately satisfying. Edmund and Fiona spent their days planning a future that would blend English and Scottish traditions, a life honoring both their heritages. They agreed the wedding would take place at Wetherby Hall's chapel, but would incorporate Highland customs, traditional vows alongside English promises, presence of a piper, display of both Ashford coat of arms and McAllister clan colours. Laird Duncan, learning of the public declaration and recognizing his daughter's determination, eventually softened his opposition. He could not condone her choice, he wrote, but neither would he permanently estrange himself from his only child. He would attend the wedding, though his presence should not be interpreted as approval. The ceremony took place on a crisp September morning, the chapel filled with those guests willing to defy social pressure in favor of witnessing genuine love triumphant. Margaret wept throughout, vindicated in her romantic scheming. Sir Thomas Willoughby attended and declared it the most honest wedding he had witnessed in decades. The Dowager Viscountess remained conspicuously absent, maintaining her protest from the Dower House. Edmund and Fiona exchanged their vows with hands clasped and eyes locked, speaking promises they both intended to honor, he to respect her independence, she to trust his partnership. When the vicar pronounced them married, the piper stationed outside began playing a Highland air that drifted through the open doors, wild and free, and utterly inappropriate for an English wedding, which made it perfect for theirs. The months following brought gradual social rehabilitation. Edmund's management of his estates proved unaffected by his choice of wife, his business acumen unchanged by matrimonial unconventionality. Fiona's forthright manner gradually earned respect from tenants who appreciated her practical approach. She established a lending library in the village, funded education for tenant children, and generally behaved exactly as unconventionally as she had promised. The transformation of the Dowager Viscountess occurred approximately 18 months after the wedding, when Fiona delivered a healthy son with copper hair, marking him unmistakably as his mother's child. The Dowager, summoned to meet her grandson, arrived at Wetherby Hall prepared to maintain dignified disapproval. What she encountered instead was a robust infant with Ashford features softened by Celtic coloring. A child who regarded her with intelligent green eyes and gripped her offered finger with surprising strength. She observed Fiona nursing the child with capable efficiency, noted Edmund's obvious devotion to both wife and son, and recognized something she had been too proud to admit: that genuine affection produced stronger families than strategic alliance. With a movement that surprised everyone, especially herself, she removed from her neck a small golden locket, one that had belonged to her lost second son, and placed it gently in the baby's blankets, a silent gesture of transferred legacy and acceptance. Her reconciliation with Edmund and grudging acceptance of Fiona came gradually. She never became warm precisely, but she acknowledged that her son had chosen well, that the Highland blood she had so feared had brought vitality rather than scandal, and that her grandson would benefit from having parents who actually loved each other. Fiona, for her part, discovered that marriage to Edmund differed fundamentally from the bondage she had feared. He consulted her regarding estate decisions, valued her opinions on matters both domestic and financial, and never attempted to diminish her fierce independence. She maintained correspondence with radical thinkers, continued her educational projects, and raised her children, for more followed the copper-haired heir, to question authority and think independently. Their marriage became, in time, something of a local legend: the Highland girl who had sworn never to wed, and the English Viscount who had valued authenticity over appropriateness. They quarreled, certainly, for neither possessed particularly compliant temperament. But they quarreled as equals, resolved disputes through genuine discussion, and built a partnership that validated both their risks. Years later, when their eldest son prepared for his own entry into society, Fiona reflected on the vows she had broken and the life she had found instead. She did not regret her fierce independence or the years she had spent defending it, but neither did she regret having discovered that the right partner enhanced rather than diminished authentic self, that trust given wisely enriched rather than impoverished, and that love, genuine love, not the convenient arrangements society typically celebrated, justified every social battle they had fought to claim it. Edmund, finding her in the library where so much of their story had unfolded, settled beside her with the comfortable familiarity of years shared. He observed that their son showed distressing signs of inheriting his mother's stubborn independence, and what were they to do with a child who questioned everything and refused to accept authority merely because tradition demanded it? Fiona's response, that they would raise him exactly as they had been raised themselves, to value authenticity over conformity and choose genuine feeling over comfortable pretense, made Edmund smile with the same mixture of exasperation and admiration he had felt since their first dance all those years ago. And so, another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society, proving that the strongest families are built not upon genealogical calculation, but upon the foundation of genuine regard, mutual respect, and the courage to choose partnership over propriety when the two conflict.